Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the daily shiur of Rambam, 3 chapters per day. I remember many years ago in the 80s, used to be a time where hyperinflation was very much common in Israel, to such an extent that thanks to the inflation, a large group of Chassidim managed to fly to the Rebbe for free. At that time in Israel was heavily regulated, and to purchase any form of currency was allowed only if you are flying abroad, if you are flying overseas, and even the amount was I think about $1,000 you would be allowed to purchase from the bank. So what happened at that time, the gap between the price of the dollars in the black market and the dollar in the bank were about double. So people who purchased basically a ticket and they owe the money to the travel agent, and they went with the ticket to the bank and they were allowed to buy dollars at the bank's rate and later sell the same dollars in the black market and basically pay for the ticket and have some change, which enables them to basically fly for free. That's how the hyperinflation and over-regulation were in Israel in those days. And I remember one of the common solution that those economical geniuses introduced was to change the currency from lira into shekel. And the common saying used to be in Israel in those days, well, people are saying lirot, but they mean shekels, yet thinking in terms of dollars. And that was a common saying that really reflected the reality in Israel in those days. Although some changes have been made, but again, people still remember, still appreciate, and impacts of those times are still around. Now I'm saying it since today's topic and the subject of the Rambam today is the halachot, the rules of shekels, SHKALIM, plural. In the Torah, in Parshas Kitiso, which describes the entire fall of the Jews by committing the greatest crime of all times, the sin of the golden calf. So God Almighty speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu and tells him he should go and order that each and every Jew would contribute an amount that would be equal to half a shekel. 10 geira, it's a unit, it's a monetary unit, that at that time, as opposed to today's form of currency, which is fiat currency that has no intrinsic value and it's based only on equity and debt, at that time a currency used to have an intrinsic value due to the amount of silver or gold that it used to represent. So therefore the biblical half a shekel reflects a actual weight of about 14 grams of silver. This amount of actual intrinsic value plus the liquidity of that currency that is being coined by the government was the combined value that each and every Jew were contributed at that time for the purpose to atone their souls and to channel some of the collected currency towards the construction of the tabernacle, the construction of part of the Mishkan in those times. The foundations of the Mishkan, the Adanim, and so forth. Though that the actual original texts in the Torah is referring to a particular time and event that was associated with the aftermath of the golden calf sin, the Chet HaEgel, yet permanently this ruling is applicable to each and every time that the Beis Hamikdash is standing and the offerings are being brought over there daily. So the financing of those offerings of the daily Korban Tamid, the afternoon Tamid, the morning Tamid, the Bazichin, and all other activities that were associated in the Bet HaMikdash used to start a new budget from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. All the offerings beginning from Rosh Chodesh Nisan on until the next Rosh Chodesh Nisan would have been financed by this year's contribution of the half a shekel that was given by each and every adult male Jew. Any Jew who is a male and an adult, he is obligated to contribute towards this machatzit hashekel. Now, what was even more important, that this collection of the half a shekel was was associated with enforcement. If a person would reject to contribute, so initially he would be warned, and if he would not listen, even steps as taking away his shirt and sell it towards the contribution of machatzit shekel were taken as well. The only segment of society that were exempt from a severe enforcement were the Kohanim. The Kohanim, they were all in a very nice, in a very maybe intimidating way, they were approached, but they were never enforced, given the act of appreciation of their contribution and activity throughout the year. So therefore there is a limit how far can I draw the line with the enforcement stage towards them contributing the half a shekel. Now, what is very interesting about the process of enforcement used to start by announcing, first letting everybody know about their obligation, used to take place at Rosh Chodesh, at the first day of the month of Adar. So the official reason that were given why the first day of the month of Adar, since it is precisely 30 days right before the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right before the new budget, the new year end or year beginning starts, and for therefore makes everybody to be ready. This is the official reason. But then there is a very interesting reason that were given and were quoted lots by the Rebbe. In Medrash it is given that when Haman Harasha Haman persuaded the king Achashverosh to go ahead with the final solution towards what he called it at that time the Jewish problem, so he gave Achashverosh an incentive, a 10,000 kikar kesef, silver bars, in order to smoothen up the decree that Achashverosh will give. God Almighty said that the shekels that the Jews have contributed and they are being commanded to give at this particular time of the year, they have kodmu shikleihem leshkolecho, that their shekels are being prioritized in my eyes over your shekels, over your silver bars that you are contributing to Achashverosh for him to go ahead with the decree. So given the fact that Adar is the time when the Jewish soul has been saved and they stood in a state of Mesirut Nefesh, they were basically sacrificed their life because they had an option not to be Jewish and they would be saved from the decree, and yet because of their Mesiut Nefesh they stood up. Therefore God Almighty actually brought the salvation that we are marking today as the greatest and the happiest holiday of all, the holiday of Purim. The procedure of the, since you came in, I will start with a joke. Once upon a time was a person, a very wealthy man, who lived in a community who died. Although he was very wealthy, but he was not known, to say mildly, with his generosity. And they have noticed that his son-in-law, when he heard that he died, he didn't react. Everybody knew he was close to him, he was even a business partner, and so he didn't react. And then suddenly, in middle of the funeral, suddenly he started to cry. And everybody turned to him and he asked, why suddenly now? He says, because right now I'm convinced that he is dead. He says, seriously, how? He says, I saw that the pushke of tzedakah, pushke is the tzedakah box, are coming in his proximity and he is not running away. I know he is dead. I remembered this story since the actual half a shekels that they were collecting from the people and channeling it towards the temple used to have a very, very precise and very structured procedure. First of all, they took in the temple itself, they used to have 13 boxes where the actual coins were collected. Now, each and every box had a very specific shape. The shape were very narrow on top and very wide in the bottom. And the reason, in order to prevent any form of a person showing off as he actually giving, but yet at the same time taking away coins from the pushke. So in order to avoid any appeal to a person who is tempted to steal or to embezzle those funds, so this structure of those pushkes were made. Used to be 13 type of pushkes that, in addition to the annual contribution of the half a shekel towards the budget of the offerings in Beis Hamikdash, were as well some boxes to pay off due amounts from previous years that were not collected for one reason or another. Other boxes is for those people who have a commitment to bring bird offerings. In bird offerings, there is an offering which is called chatos, where some of the kohanim will benefit from the meat, and then there is a bird offering which is called oilo, where no benefits is being given to the kohanim and entirely goes to the Beis Hamikdash. Was another box were contributed to different nedovo, generous form of offerings, others for flower offerings, and so on and so forth. After they have been bringing all the funds that they have managed to collect from each and every community, both in Israel and abroad, they were placing it into heavy, large containers. Each and every container were in a volume of about 80 liters type of container. 3 big containers of about that they are able to contain 80 liters. They placed over there the coins. Anything that those containers were not able to contain remained on the floor of the Lishko. Lishko was the department. The reason why they were actually doing it in 3 big containers, since each and every eve of any biblical holiday, the holiday of Passover, the holiday of Shavuos, and the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, they were actually taking from those containers in order to purchase the offerings, the cattle and the sheep and the byproducts that were associated with them, in order to have the offerings ready to bring throughout the entire season. So therefore, when a person actually came in each and every eve of every biblical holiday to collect these funds, they took some major security procedures that wouldn't be a bad idea to apply and to adapt those methods to the banking systems today. For example, when the person went inside the room to take out funds, they made sure that first of all, he is not a desperate person. He should be independently wealthy. B, they made sure that all his dresses have no pockets in them. Third, they were continuously not stopping talking with him. While his mouth is busy talking, his mouth won't be a storage for stolen money. This, so far, they went into assure that no temptation to go and steal and to embezzle those funds should be taking place, while the person who were actually collecting from those containers in order to subsidize, in order to finance the korbanos, the offerings of the year. Another topic that is being dealt in the 2nd chapter is the fact that while the were separating those funds from those containers, they were having in mind not only those funds that they possessing, but also what they called expected receivable. These amounts of money that will be coming to them tomorrow and a day later from the rest of the Jewish community around the world. Now, the fact that they were considering also future contribution, as they call it today in English, receivables, not cash on hand or assets that they are right on hand, but also receivables, has some major implication which happened to be in the 3rd chapter. Implication number 1, just imagine a community is sending an agent with their collected funds that they managed to collect from the community, and they paid him for it. But then, on the way there, some gang robbers fell on him and they robbed him from all his funds. So obviously, since the event is being considered oines, beyond control event, so the agent is not liable to pay anything. But the question over here, would the community be liable to make a new appeal and a fundraising campaign to raise those funds again? And the answer depends when the robbery took place. If the robbery took place after the contribution that took place in the temple by the person who took from those containers, and he had in mind that he is toilem, what we called he having in mind that the amount of contribution is also for the other communities, so those robbers, in fact, technically, they didn't rob that from him. They robbed it from the temple. And therefore, the community is not liable to make a repeat fundraising because it was not stolen from them. It was stolen from the Bet HaMikdash, from the temple. However, if the robbery took place before the tumo, before the separation of the funds from the container in the temple, so that time the robbery were robbed, the community have been robbed. If the community have been robbed, they have to make a new fundraising campaign to replace those funds that have been robbed by them or robbed from them, from this agent who were presenting them. Another implication from the fact that in the Beis HaMikdash they were proclaiming in a certain point that the money that they are taking from those containers is on behalf, not only on behalf of the money they have, but also the receivable, the future money that they will receive, is being reflected in the following halacha. If one individual send his friend, he says, here I'm giving you this half a shekel, please take this half a shekel and give it on my behalf into the Beis HaMikdash, on my behalf. Now this person took this half a shekel and he said, if it's good for him, it will be good for me. So instead to give it on the behalf of his friend, he gave it on his own behalf. He so-called breached the promise of the friend. So the question over here, obviously he breached the trust that the friend placed in him. But if he has done so after the Tuumas Halishko, after the separation of the funds in the temple, so he is not just breaching the trust of the friend, he is actually embezzling from Hekdesh. He is taking away from the temple. Taking any form of embezzlement called me'ilo has different halachic implication, which is associated with a korban, associated with a payment, associated with another procedure. However, if he has done so before the declaration in the temple, so it's something personal that he needs to repay his friend. So here you see a very interesting differences in halacha from the fact that in the temple, when they were actually separating those funds, they were not only taking those funds that they had already, but they were actually proclaiming that they are toilem, they are contributing from those funds also to the leosid lovri. Leosid lovri for the future funds they having in the mind as well. Another fascinating issue that is being covered in the third chapter is the fact that since this half a shekel coin used to be a very rare commodity, and therefore the demand for those half a shekels were exceeded way the supply. For that reason, any person who came to the money exchange with 1 shekel in order for the money exchange in the temple to exchange it for 2 halves a shekel. He came for 1 shekel, given the fact that there is a shortage, a special fee which was equal to about 4.5% of the amount of half a shekel were imposed upon him, and this extra fee used to be called kalboin. This kalboin were levied to any person who had a different currency of half a shekel and went ahead, and sometimes a person will be exempt from paying a kalbon. For example, when he is contributing a shekel to the temple, but he is contributing half of the shekel to a person who is exempt from contribution. A person who is exempt from contribution, given the fact that he has an excessive contribution, so therefore he will be exempt from the levy and the special assessment fee of the kalboin. It is very important to note that Moshe Rabbeinu had big difficulties, said in the Midrash, in three things. The name of Moshe consists of three letters, Mem, Shin, and Hey. And Chazal are teaching us that throughout his career, three of the commandments that God gave him were quite difficult for him to grasp. What were those three? Mem, menorah. The complexity of the menorah, the shape, and the need to do it out of one piece of metal was quite difficult for him, and the only way God happened to display for him the shape of the menorah by him throwing it to the fire, and he says, "V'na'aset me'elea," and it will be done on its own. Shin, shekel, the half a shekel, Moshe was very difficult for him to comprehend how half a shekel contribution would be able to atone the greatest sin that were ever made and the greatest breach of trust that were committed by the Jews. So Chazal are saying in Medrash that God Almighty took out from the throne of honor, Kisei HaKavod, a coin made of fire, and told him, Ze itnu, kaze itnu. This coin they will give, like this coin they should give. Throughout the many years of Farbrengens, each and every year, the Rebbe was taking apart this text of the Medrash, and every time used to take a different dimension, a new depth into the meaning of the Medrash, the application to our life. One of the famous explanations that are quite known by the Rebbe, that the idea of a coin represents the motion of discipline. Fire represents enthusiasm and excitement. Typically, people who are very good in discipline are very terrible in enthusiasm and excitement. People who are heavily inspired, not necessarily they are good in discipline. In order for a person to encompass both of the opposites type of side, so the level of humility, devotion, and connection and tie to God Almighty needs to be at the most intense and essential form. And only such a connection can really reignite back the lost connection that were tempered by the greatest sin of all, the sin of Chet HaEgel. So that was basically the secret, how this half a shekel, not only just a matbeya shel age, a coin, a discipline that has yet the fire, the enthusiasm in it, also there is something very symbolic in that. The symbol over here that every person is essentially a half. The only way he can grow and he can accomplish when he will always view himself as a half of another person, a half of another community, a half that there is always another side of expectation that God really expects from him. And in a conclusion, in that spirit, I would like to conclude with a story once I heard from Rabbi FISCAL. He says like this, talking about halves. He says, when one Hasid is in a city, it's too little. When you have two Hasidim in a city, it's too much. The perfect solution to have a Hasid and a half. So he says, unfortunately, many people say, well, you be the half and let me be the one. He says, the real solution, and when people are really taking upon themselves, they should be the half, and they should always view the other person as the fullest one. May God bless all of us. We should always sense ourselves as really as a half only, a half, and therefore we always need to strive and to aim to complete the other half. Thank you.